The sky above was dark green with black clouds swirling like smoke as heavy winds blew across the rocky plains of planet Varex, where the storms were never soft and the rain was not water but something that burned on skin and metal the way acid eats through wires and flesh. So when the human scout named Jace saw the storm rolling in, he knew he had only minutes to find cover before it reached him. He had been dropped on this forgotten planet as part of a survey mission alone with only his scanner, his pack, and his instincts, which had kept him alive more than once, but even his instincts had not warned him about what he was about to find. As he ran through the twisted trees and sharp rocks, he spotted the entrance to a narrow cave, half hidden by vines and rubble, and without wasting a second, he ducked inside, just as the first drops hissed against the stones behind him. Inside the cave, it was cold and dark and silent except for the wind outside and his own breathing echoing softly against the walls. He turned on his wrist light and moved deeper using the scanner to check for radiation or danger, but what he found instead was something strange. A sound faint and soft like a whimper, like someone trying not to cry. He paused, held his breath, and listened again, and there it was, a small voice, high-pitched, weak, not words, just sounds, broken little sounds of fear and pain. He followed the noise slowly, carefully, every step echoing until he reached the far end of the cave, where a strange metal structure stood wedged between the rocks. It was a cage, not human, not like anything he had seen before, with glowing blue lines running across the bars and small sharp spikes on the corners, and inside it, curled up and shaking, was something small, a tiny creature no bigger than a backpack. Her skin was light purple, almost glowing in the dark, her eyes huge and green, filled with tears and terror, her limbs thin, her hair soft and silver, tangled and messy. She wore what looked like scraps of fabric barely covering her bruised body. She saw Jason whimpered louder, backing away into the corner of the cage, trying to hide her face with her tiny arms. Jace froze, not sure what he was looking at. She looked like a child, maybe 5 or 6 in human age, but clearly alien. Her body proportions different, her ears long and pointed, and her fingers tipped with soft glowing pads. She was beautiful and broken and terrified, and Jace felt his heart twist in a way it had not twisted since his sister had died years ago. He stepped closer slowly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm, speaking softly, though he knew she would not understand the words. It was the tone that mattered, and he kept it calm and warm and kind. She did not move, only watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked at the cage, at the lock, at the strange energy pulsing around the bars, and knew he could not leave her here. He pulled out his multi-tool, set it to pulse cut, and aimed at the locking mechanism. Sparks flew, the metal hissed, and after a few seconds, the lock dropped with a loud click. The bars dimmed, the energy lines flickered, and the door slid open. She did not move, not yet, too afraid to believe it real. He crouched and waited, gave her time, until finally, slowly, carefully, she crawled toward the edge of the cage, then out, then collapsed at his feet, her body too weak to stand. He wrapped her gently in his emergency blanket and lifted her into his arms. She was light, so light, like carrying feathers, and she did not fight, just trembled against his chest as he carried her back toward the front of the cave. The storm still roaring outside, but he knew he would wait it out here with her safe in his arms. He sat near the wall, set her down on the softest part of his pack, and gave her water from his flask. She looked at it, unsure, then at him, then took a sip and drank like she had not tasted water in days. She looked up at him, her eyes still scared, but less so, and he smiled at her gently. She did not smile back, not yet, but she did not cry either, and that was something. He pulled off his jacket and laid it over her small form, then sat beside her, watching the entrance of the cave and listening to the storm outside and the quiet breathing beside him. And though he did not know who she was or where she came from or why she had been caged like an animal, one thing he knew for sure: he was not leaving her behind. The storm outside finally ended, leaving the sky above gray and thick with clouds as the acid rain dried into steam rising from the rocks like smoke from an old battlefield. The cave was quiet now, but not peaceful, because inside the fear had not yet passed. The girl still sat curled beneath the human jacket, her small arms hugging her knees, her eyes never leaving. The human who had freed her just kept his distance, knowing too well what fear looked like and not wanting to make it worse. He moved slowly, speaking soft words she could not understand, but his voice was calm like warm wind after winter, like a story whispered in the dark. His hands stayed open, his posture Lo, he did not stare at her, did not reach for her, just waited. She was not ready. Her name was still a mystery, her voice still silent, but she watched everything, her eyes wide and glassy, her breath shallow and shaky, every movement she noticed, every noise outside made her flinch, every shadow from the cave wall made her curl tighter into herself like she was trying to disappear. Just cooked a small meal from his ration pack, something soft and warm and not too strong in smell. He placed it in a small container and gently slid it toward her, then backed away. She looked at it, then at him, her tiny fingers reached out but stopped halfway. She sniffed the food, then finally took it and brought it close like it might vanish. She ate slowly, eyes never blinking, never trusting fully, but hunger won over fear for a moment. He watched her, thinking of his sister again. How she used to hide behind the couch during storms, how she would not speak for hours after their parents fought, how she only came out when Jace whispered silly stories and promised to protect her. He felt the same way now, like he needed to protect this little alien, like she was part of something he had lost. She finished the food and placed the container near him like she was giving it back, not as thanks but as ritual, then went back under the jacket, not speaking, not moving, but breathing more calmly. Now just leaned back against the cave wall and stared at the ceiling, cracked and wet, but safe compared to the outside world. He checked his scanner. No ships, no signals, no movement, just silence and static. They were alone for now, but he knew it would not last. Nothing ever did. In the galaxy, set up his light projector and dimmed it to a soft glow enough to keep the shadows away without hurting the eyes, then unrolled his sleep mat and spread it on the cave floor, not too close to her, not too far. He lay down, watching the ceiling, then turned his head just enough to see her still awake, still watching. Hours passed, maybe more. He dozed off once, maybe twice, but always woke up to find her awake, always in the same spot, eyes glowing slightly in the dark like stars afraid to close, like she believed monsters would come back if she blinked finally. Maybe from exhaustion, maybe from trust, she crawled toward him slowly, silently, with the jacket dragging behind her like a cloak. She reached his side but did not touch him, just lay down close enough to feel his warmth, then closed her eyes for the first time. Jace did not move, did not speak, just watched her breathe, tiny soft breaths like wind through leaves, and as she slept he felt something shift, not in the air, not in the cave, but inside him, like an invisible string had tied itself between them, not as a duty, not as a mission, but something older, something deeper, like the universe had whispered, "You are not alone anymore." He stayed awake most of the night, listening to her dreams, little sounds, little sighs. No screams, no cries, only quiet peace, like her mind had let go of fear for one small moment. When morning came, he did not wake her right away. Instead, he packed slowly, folded the blanket, cleaned the cave, made everything neat, like they were never there. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at him, and for the first time she did not flinch. He smiled and stood, offering his hand, not expecting her to take it, but hoping, and after a long pause, she reached out, her fingers cold and shaking, and placed them gently in his palm. They walked out of the cave together into the pale light of the new day, and though the air still smelled of acid, and the sky still hung heavy with danger, the world felt a little lighter, a little less cruel, because she was not in that cage anymore, and he was not alone anymore, and that was enough. The forest beyond the cave was wet and silent, as if the storm had washed away not just the dirt and dust, but the sounds and breath of the world itself. Trees tall and twisted reached into the sky with black leaves dripping poison dew, while small creatures watched from shadows with eyes that did not blink. And in the middle of this strange world, a man and a girl walked side by side, one tall and quiet, the other small and silent, wrapped in a jacket too big for her shoulders. Jace held his scanner low, keeping his steps slow and steady, while the alien girl stayed close behind her, bare feet barely making a sound, her silver hair tangled her thin arms, holding the edge of the jacket tight around her chest. She did not speak, she did not cry, but her eyes kept looking upward, scanning the sky like she expected something to fall from it, like she had seen before what hunted from above. They crossed through a narrow stream, then followed a line of rocks toward a higher ridge where Jace hoped to find a signal or shelter or at least dry ground. But before they reached the top, his scanner began to blink, not loud, not fast, but steady. A red light that meant only one thing: movement in the air, and it was not human. He stopped, and the Girl bumped gently into his side, her head turned toward the sky, and without needing a word, her body began to shake, and her hands gripped his arm with a strength that did not match her size. She pointed up, and Jace looked with his own eyes and saw it, a shape, silver and silent, flying low, just above the trees like a ghost made of metal. The drone had no lights, no sound, just a smooth surface and a glowing core pulsing like a heartbeat. Its wings barely moved, yet it glided with perfect balance, scanning everything below it with invisible beams that could read heat and sound and thought, and he knew without a doubt it was looking for Hergis. Pulled her close and dropped behind a fallen tree, covering them with mud and leaves and anything he could reach. She did not resist, she did not question, she just pressed her small body into his and held her breath. Like she had done this before many times, like she knew how to hide better than any soldier. The drone passed above them, slow and careful, scanning the ground inch by inch. But they stayed still, not even blinking, until the sound of the wind returned and the machine disappeared behind the cliffs. Only then did they move, only then did she let out a breath, and only then did he realize what danger they were in. They had come back for her, whoever had trapped her, whoever had caged her, whoever had sent machines across the galaxy to hunt her. They knew she was free, and they were not going to let her go. Without a fight, Jace stood and looked down at her, her face pale, her lips tight, but her eyes still glowing with life. He took her hand and led her off the ridge, away from the scanner's reach, toward an old path he remembered from the satellite maps, a trail that led to a broken tower where maybe, just maybe, he could find an old comm system to send a signal home. They walked fast now, moving like hunted animals, not stopping to eat or rest, her feet leading but silent, his muscles burning but strong. And as they moved through the twisted forest, the girl began to point out paths before him, warning him of traps, roots that moved, holes that breathed, plants that hissed. She had lived in this nightmare longer than him, and she knew its secrets. At one point she stopped him with a whisper and pulled him behind a thick bush, and just seconds later, a different drone, not flying but crawling past along the ground, its legs sharp and long, its body shaped like a spider, and its sensors glowing red. It clicked and scanned and moved on without seeing them, but the fear in her eyes grew deeper, and Jace knew they were running out of time. Night came fast and cold, and he found a shallow cave just deep enough to hide them from the sky. He set no fire, no light, only a soft blanket and shared ration packs. She did not eat much, just leaned against him, eyes wide open, listening to every sound outside, every leaf, every howl, every rustle. He wrapped his arm around her and whispered that he would not let them take her, and though she could not understand the words, she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and for the first time since the drones came, she slept. Outside in the dark above the clouds, the hunters circled again, but inside the cave too, survivors held on to each other in silence, one made of fear and strength, the other of warmth and will. And though they were only a man and a child in a forest too big and wild to control, the stars had already started to shift in their favor, because they were not done running, not yet, not now. The morning came without sunlight, as thick gray clouds hung low over the forest like heavy curtains, and the wind whispered through the twisted branches with voices that sounded almost alive. Jace opened his eyes to the cold air and the soft pressure of a small head resting against his shoulder. The alien girl still asleep, her breath slow and calm, her fingers curled into the edge of his jacket as if holding on to a piece of safety that might slip away. He stayed still for a while, letting her rest, not wanting to break the fragile peace between them. But when her eyes opened wide and bright, he smiled and gave a small nod. She returned it with a slight tilt of her head, then sat up, her silver hair falling across her face as she rubbed her eyes like any child would on any quiet morning. But this was not any morning, and they were not safe, not yet. They packed quickly and left the shallow cave behind, moving through narrow paths between thorn-covered trees and deep puddles that steamed when touched. They were heading toward the ruins of an old research outpost abandoned years ago after the war, where Jace hoped to find shelter or maybe an old power unit to charge his comm and send a distress call. But he kept that thought quiet because something in his gut told him help might not come fast enough. The girl followed close, never complaining, never asking, just moving with quiet strength. Despite her small size and fragile frame, she had learned to walk softly like a shadow, and even Jace found himself copying her steps without thinking. She pointed toward safe ground and warned him of glowing plants that pulsed with poison, and he began to realize she knew this forest far better than he did, not just from memory, but something deeper, like the ground spoke to her in ways he could not hear. It happened when they reached a broken clearing where sharp rocks jutted from the ground like knives and the air felt colder than before. Jace stepped on a loose stone and it gave way, sending him tumbling down a short slope, not far but hard enough to knock the breath from his chest. And as he rolled, he saw the edge of a cliff, too close, too fast, and he reached out, grabbing at the ground, but there was nothing to stop him. Then the world paused, not in sound, not in time, but in motion. The rocks below him stopped falling, the dust hung still, the very edge of the cliff no longer crumbling, and when he looked back he saw her standing there, one hand raised, her face filled with fear and focus, and something glowing in her eyes that was not light but power. Her fingers trembled, and the air around her shimmered like heat waves rising from fire, and Jace felt himself lifted, not by ropes or wind, but by force invisible and strong, pulling him back to safety as the rocks beneath finally gave way and tumbled into the abyss below. He landed on solid ground, heart pounding, chest heaving, and when he looked up she was still standing frozen, as if afraid of what she had done. He reached for her gently, not with fear but with awe, and whispered words she could not understand, but the tone was enough. She lowered her hand slowly and fell to her knees, covering her face as her body shook, not from cold, not from pain, but from something else, something deeper, like shame. She had not meant to do it, maybe she had not known she could, but now it was out, now it was real, and she looked at him expecting anger or fear or rejection. But instead he sat beside her and wrapped the jacket around her shoulders and simply said thank you with a soft voice and a small smile. The rest of the day passed in quiet steps and thoughtful looks. They reached the edge of the ruins just before sunset and found the old station half buried in vines and ash. The doors rusted, the windows cracked, but the walls still strong enough to keep out the wind. They entered, carefully checking for signs of life, but found none, only silence and dust and old machines that still hummed with forgotten energy. She explored the place, slowly touching walls and broken screens with curiosity. While Jace worked to restart the power using spare cells and cables from his pack, he managed to light a few panels and start the heating unit, and for the first time in days the cold faded from their bones. That night she sat beside him on the floor, her hands in her lap, her eyes staring into the dim glow of the lights, and he watched her closely, not with suspicion but with wonder, because now he knew there was more to her than fear and silence, more than escape and survival. There was something powerful inside her, something the hunters had wanted to control, and maybe something the universe had tried to hide. She turned to him and whispered one word, soft and small and full of meaning, her first word in his language. Safe. He nodded and whispered it back, and they sat there, not as strangers, not as a rescuer and a victim, but as something new, something stronger, something that could no longer be hunted without a fight. The sky above the ruined station turned a soft blue as the night faded into a quiet morning, and for the first time since Jace landed on this broken planet, the sun pushed through the clouds like a slow golden wave, melting the darkness without warning, without sound. Its light touched the edges of the station, casting long shadows on the floor where two forms sat side by side. One small and glowing, one tired but awake. Jace looked out the window panel, cracked but still clear enough to see the horizon, where blinking lights had begun to appear, small red flashes in the distance, like distant stars drawing closer. He checked his scanner and saw the signal, clear and strong and real. It was not a threat. Not this time, not the hunters, not a drone, but something from Earth, a rescue ship finally responding to his last ping, finally on its way. The girl stood beside him, her eyes following his gaze, then looking back at him, not speaking, not smiling, just waiting. She did not need words to ask what he was thinking, and he did not need words to know what she feared. If they found her, if they saw her, if they took her from him, it would not be safety. It would be a cage again, and this time maybe even colder. Jace moved quickly, now setting up the outer perimeter, hiding every sign of her presence. He cleaned the extra sleeping mat, buried the empty ration packs, erased the prints from the floor, and placed her inside a supply locker with a blanket and a bottle of water, not as a prisoner, But as a secret, as something fragile the world could not be trusted to protect, she did not fight. She did not cry, she just nodded once and curled up. Inside the small space, her knees to her chest, her arms around the jacket he had given her like a shield of warmth. He closed the door gently, not locked, not sealed, just enough to keep her hidden, just enough to let the lie breathe. The ship arrived with a slow descent, engines humming with a sound he had missed more than he knew as it landed. Beside the station, dust and leaves flew into the air, and the ramp dropped with a hiss, and from it came 3 figures in white suits, one holding a scanner, one carrying a med pack, one looking around with eyes sharp and careful. They greeted him with relief, asked if he was hurt, asked what happened, asked if there were any anomalies, any unusual discoveries, any signs of life on the planet beyond the flora and toxic weather, and Jay smiled and shook his head and told them no. He said the station was dead. He said he had survived alone. He said there was nothing out there worth mentioning. They scanned the area, found nothing unusual, took his report and marked it complete. They never looked twice at the supply locker, never asked about the extra. Matt never noticed the faint prints smaller than a boot print, never wondered why his rations were shorter than they should have been. Pilot gave the order to leave, and Jace followed them onto the ship, every step heavy, every breath tight, every heartbeat louder than the last, until the door closed behind them, and the engines roared to life, and they rose from the surface, lifting into the sky, leaving the ruins and the forest and the silence behind inside the cargo bay, hidden between crates and sealed compartments. The girl lay still, wrapped in the blanket, breathing slow and steady, her tiny hands gripping the edges of the jacket like she was holding on to a dream she had once lost and found again. Hours passed before Jace returned to check on her, opening the compartment slowly, whispering her name, not because she had told him it, but because he had given her one. Something simple, something soft, something only they shared. She looked up at him with tired eyes and smiled, the first real smile he had ever seen from her, and it lit the small space like a star born in shadows. He helped her out, gave her a warm drink from his own thermos, and told her they were going home. She did not ask where, she did not ask how, she just nodded and leaned against him, resting her head on his arm as the ship flew through the stars, leaving the hunters and the pain and the cold behind. In his report he wrote nothing about her in his logs. He mentioned no discovery in his data. There was no trace of the girl who had lifted stones with her mind, who had run from machines, who had whispered the word safe like it was magic, because sometimes the truth is not meant for files and records. Sometimes it belongs in hearts and hands and quiet moments shared between those who choose to protect without reason, without reward, just because they must. She slept beside him that night in the small crew quarters, her body curled against his, her breath soft against his side, and as the stars drifted past the window, Jace knew the lie he told would be the one choice he never regretted, because she was free and with him and safe. The house stood at the edge of the forest, far from the city, far from noise, far from anyone who might ask too many questions. Its roof was old but strong, its walls made of wood and stone, its garden wild and growing and full of light. And in that quiet space, between trees and sky, between past and future, a man and a girl made a home where no one could find them, where no one could take her again. Jace moved like a builder, slow and steady, fixing broken doors, planting vegetables, gathering firewood, and checking the sky every night, like he still expected ships to come, like he still heard the hum of machines in his dreams. But they never came, not after that day, not after the escape, not after he lied to the men in white and brought her back wrapped in shadows and silence and hope. She had changed since then, grown stronger, louder, still small, but no longer afraid. Her eyes no longer wide with fear, but wide with wonder. She explored the garden, picked flowers, chased birds, sat in the sun and laughed. Not often, but enough to make his heart ache in ways he had not felt in years. She called him by a name now, her voice soft and clear, a name that meant safe, a name that meant home. She had learned to speak slowly, one word at a time, one memory at a time, sometimes wrong, sometimes strange, but always trying and always proud when he smiled and nodded and said, "Good job." They cooked together, each meal a game, each dish a discovery. She liked sweet things and hated salt. She liked warm tea with honey and soft bread with jam. She fed the birds with crumbs and told them stories in her own tongue, and he watched her and listened and never asked too much, never pushed, just waited. At Night, when the stars came out and the wind moved through the trees, she would curl beside him on the bed, a small shape under soft blankets, her head on his arm, her breath slow and calm, like the world outside no longer mattered, like time itself had paused to let her sleep without fear. Sometimes she had dreams, sometimes she cried in her sleep, sometimes she whispered words he could not understand, and when that happened, he would hold her gently and speak softly and wait until she settled again, until her dreams turned quiet again, until her hand found his and held it tight. He never asked what they had done to her, never made her tell the story of the cage or the pain or the men with cold hands and sharp eyes. He did not need to know the details because he had seen the scars, not on her skin, but in her silence and her flinches in the way she once looked at the sky with dread and now looked with wonder. She began drawing with sticks on the ground, then with pencils on paper, her pictures, strange and bright, full of stars and ships and trees with faces and animals with wings and people with glowing hands. He kept everyone, pinned them on the walls, smiled. When she showed him a new one, smiled even more. When she drew him always taller than the trees, always holding her hand. One day she pointed at the sky and said, "Home," and he asked softly, "Is this your home, or is your home up there?" And she looked at him and said, "Here," and he knew she meant it, and something inside him cracked open, something old and buried, something broken and tired, and it made his eyes wet, but he did not look away. The seasons changed, leaves turned gold, then fell, snow came and covered the garden in soft white, and still they stayed, still they laughed, still she curled beside him each night, her small hands cold at first, then warm against his chest. Sometimes he would walk into town alone to get supplies, to trade, to hear news, and always he kept his answers short, always he returned before dark, always he found her waiting at the gate, eyes bright, face smiling, jacket too big for her shoulders and arms wide to greet him. No one ever followed, no one ever asked too much. And even if they did, he would never give her up, not to scientists, not to soldiers, not to anyone, because she was not a thing to study, not a secret to sell, not a mistake to fix. She was a life, a soul, a promise, and she was his family. She sleeps beside me now, he wrote once in a journal kept hidden under the floor. She sleeps beside me now, not because she must, but because she trusts me. She sleeps beside me, not as a stranger, not as a guest, but as a child who has finally found peace, and I will never let her go. The snow had just begun to melt when Jace heard the sound, not loud, not sharp, just a faint humming far above the clouds, like something waiting to be heard, like a breath held by the stars. And in that quiet moment, standing near the garden holding a basket of fresh roots, he felt something cold run through his spine, something deeper than winter, something he thought was long gone. He looked up and saw nothing but the wind carried the sound again, and this time it was closer, and his hands gripped the basket tighter, not because he was afraid, but because he already knew the past had found them, and it had come from the sky like before, like always. She was inside, sitting on the floor, drawing a picture of a rabbit with wings, her silver hair falling over her face, her small lips smiling, and he did not want to break that smile, not yet, not if he could help it. So he placed the basket down, walked inside, and closed the door with care, his boots silent on the wooden floor as he sat beside her and asked what she was drawing. She held up the page with pride and pointed and said, "Bunny bird," and laughed, and he laughed too, and pulled her gently into his arms and held her for a long second, like he was memorizing the weight of her, like he was saying goodbye without letting her know. And then he kissed the top of her head and said, "Wait here." And she looked at him and asked, "Why?" And he said, "Just in case." And she nodded, because she trusted him more than the sky, more than the stars, more than the world that once hurt her. He moved fast, opening the cellar door beneath the kitchen, lifting the floor mat, and revealing the hiding space he had built with stone and steel and love and fear. He helped her inside, gave her the small flashlight, gave her a soft pillow, gave her the stuffed animal she had once made from scraps and string, and told her again, "Wait, and no matter what you hear, stay quiet." And she nodded again. Though her eyes were white, he closed the hatch, sealed it with the latch, and stood still, breathing slow, feeling the silence settle once more over the house. But the wind outside had changed, the birds were gone, the air heavy with something wrong. Then came the knock, not loud, not rushed, just 3 slow hits against the front door, like a rhythm too calm to be kind, and Jace stepped toward it, not with fear, but with fire in his chest and steel in his eyes. He opened it. They stood in the snow, 3 figures in long coats, their eyes hidden behind black glass, their skin pale and smooth, their hands empty, but not harmless, and one of them smiled, not with warmth but with knowing, and said, "We believe you have something that does not belong to." Jace did not move. They stepped closer. They said, "She is dangerous. She is unstable. She is a threat to the balance and safety of the Galactic Order." Jace still did not move. They said, "Return her, and we will forget this. We will erase this. We will not harm." Jace finally spoke. He said, "She is a child." He said, "She is not yours." He said, "You had your chance and you lost her." He said, "She is mine now." They reached for their weapons. He moved first. The traps were already set. The wires placed, the charges hidden in the trees. The moment the ship had crossed the sky, he had begun. Again, the old training, the old instincts, the soldier in him never died. It just waited for a reason. The first blast took out the path behind them, cutting off their escape. The second filled the snow with smoke. The third knocked them flat and by the time they stood again, Jace had taken position behind the door, shotgun-loaded boots, planted, eyes sharp as ice. He fired once, then twice, then again, until the air shook and the ground trembled and the world outside went still again. When the smoke cleared, only one figure remained, crawling, dragging itself through the blood and ash, and reaching for the edge of the steps, and Jace stood over him silent until the man whispered, "She will never be safe with you." And Jace said, "She already," as he watched as the man faded into the snow, then turned back inside, closing the door, locking it, bolting it, checking every window, every signal, every sensor, then walking to the hatch and opening it slowly. She looked up, eyes shining, lips trembling, but when she saw his face, she smiled and jumped into his arms, and he held her and said, "It is over." And she said, "Home," and he nodded. That night she slept beside him again, not because she had to, not because she was afraid, but because it was where she wanted to be. And he stayed awake for a long time, watching the stars through the window, hand resting gently on hers, heart steady, breath slow, and the words he had never spoken now clear in his mind. "They came for her again, and they met me instead, and they will never come again."